Okay, I think we can. Podemos empezar. Sí, sí. Okay, welcome everybody. I would like to start. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm the director of the USC Shaw Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and thank you all for coming. And it is my distinct pleasure to start the semester and the program of the center with a very unusual presentation. It is not a kind of the usual academic lecture, one person, 45 minutes. We have a group of researchers here which we, for the sole purpose, brought together to brainstorm a project. So this is a very unique feature of element of our academic program, which you won't find in many academic places in the US or even other countries. So just to enable a group of scholars who don't usually meet each other from different universities in different countries to come together, have the luxury of 1 week consecutive time to think about a project. And in our case, the only obligation we actually issue is that they work in some ways with the testimonies of the Visual History Archive of the USC Shaw Foundation. That's the only condition we actually propose. What we try to foster and to support is not just to bring scholars together from different countries or different universities, but also different disciplines. And I think the group we have here is testament to kind of how this actually works and how this works in the end and how this plays out. You might find out in the presentation. So they will talk maybe about this too, if there are also problems involved in this. So let me briefly, since this is a big group, just briefly introduce them by their names, affiliations, and their disciplines. They maybe talk later on about more about this. And you can also look up their biographies on our website so that we don't waste a lot of time, because otherwise with 7 people, we will end up spending all the time with the introduction. So we have Nancy Nichols Lopiandia. She's a historian, but did her PhD in sociology at the University of Essex in the UK, and is currently lecturing at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Where is she? Oh, here she is. Then we have Alejandra Morales Stekel. She is a little bit also unusual here because she is actually not kind of somebody with an academic education in the regular sense. She is a visual artist born in Santiago de Chile. She studied visual arts, so that's a very interesting complementary approach. And she is here because she has to do with the topic because she worked on the study of the Holocaust in Chile by founding a museum and working, or actually 2 museums, right? Yes. Yeah, 2 museums on Jewish history in Chile. And she is currently the executive director of the Jewish Museum of Chile. Then we have, let's say, Lorena Ávila Jaimes. She is a political scientist and has an MA in public policy from the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. And she is especially interested in between the intersection of memory studies and transitional justice. Next in line is Susana Sosenski. She holds a PhD in history from the Colegio de México. She is currently a professor at the Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México in philosophy and literature, right? Or
in history.
In history, okay. Then we have kind of the spiritus rector of the group, Yael Siman. She has a PA in international relations, a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and she is currently teaching at the history department, but also at the international relations. And here you see already kind of the interdisciplinarity within each person of them, not just between them, but already in there. At the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. And last but not least, we have, oh, yes, it's a big group. It's kind of 2 left, right. Where are you? Oh, here, Daniela. I'm kind of, Daniela Gleizer She is a historian, did her PhD in history at the Colegio de Mexico, and is currently associate professor of history at the Institute for Historical Research at the National University of Mexico, and is specialized in the immigration of Jewish refugees. And then, where's Emmanuel? Oh, here.
Yes.
Okay. So, last but not least, I present the only male colleague in this illustrious round, Emmanuel Nicholas Kahan. He has a master and PhD in history and memory studies, and comes to us from Argentina, and he got his education at the National University of La Plata, and is currently a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Research. He is also a professor of political theory at the sociology department at the National University of La Plata. You see, they switched from history to sociology for political science, and so that's a very interesting, I think, group where different experiences and educations come together, and I think very fruitfully. But they should tell you more about this. Please give them a warm hand and welcome them.
Thank you. Well, hello. It is a privilege and an honor for us to be here, and we thank you all to come and join us this afternoon. We would like to greet Mr. Stephen Smith, Executive Director of the USC Schwab Foundation, for welcoming us in his house. And of course, we are very grateful with the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, embodied in the person of his director, Wolf Gruner, for his warm reception and for this great opportunity to work together in such a place with extraordinary sources and archives. We also express our heartfelt gratitude towards all of our friends and colleagues at the USC Schwab Foundation who made our visit possible, taking care of every detail and showing us how to navigate, of course, the VHA. We would like to start by saying what drives our interest in this collective Latin American research project. The Holocaust and Latin America are frequently thought as two areas of study that remain disconnected. Nevertheless, Latin America was a fundamental region of rescue for Holocaust survivors. Existing literature on the Holocaust, exile, and migration point to the restrictive immigration policies of several Latin American governments, but knowledge of the individual experiences of survivors has remained marginal, except for Argentina, where in addition to studies on exile and migration, we can find publications on Holocaust memory that can shed light on other cases that have been less addressed. Thus, our main interest has been to investigate in a comparative way the individual experiences and narratives of Holocaust survivors who came to our region. We consider that the USA Visual History Archive offers a unique source for our research. Our team, as Wolf said, is interdisciplinary. It covers a range of interests, converging on studies on memory, Jewish history, Holocaust, and genocide and mass violence. It has a broad geographic scope: Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico. This week has been the first time we came together as a research group, allowing us to deepen our discussion, bringing our personal and different epistemological approaches and perspectives, and also allowed us to identify new areas of collaboration. This is also the first time we have the chance to research on the VHA as a whole, exploring the possibilities that it offers, as well as the type of questions that can be asked. Our discussion in the past days raised many puzzles and themes, and possible methodological pathways to address them. The next steps will further define our research project. Nancy, please.
Yael, I think you first.
So we wanted to show a little bit of what we've been working on in the past week. So we'll start with, each of us will have some voice in our presentation. We hope that's okay with all of you. So I'll start by showing the diverse universe of survivors that we're studying. So as you can see in the slide, it includes migration too, but as we discovered during this past week, also migration from Latin America, as not every survivor settled in Latin America. It includes these 4 countries that Alejandra mentioned. It includes also multiple trajectories and destinations, where from and where to are 2 questions that are relevant to our study. It includes also several countries as transit points towards other destinations. Sometimes survivors stopped in several places before finding a new home in a particular site, and also the possibility of creating a new home in this region. It shows, or it offers possibilities for examining the reasons to migrate to this region in particular. And we have to say that we're focusing on Spanish-speaking countries. We're conscious that we're leaving out a very important country such as Brazil for language limitations mainly. And our unit of analysis is the individual survivor. And these survivors are crossed by multiple collective identities. As you know, being Jewish, being a national of a particular country, coming to a different place and developing a new sense of belonging, being a migrant, being either a child, an adolescent, a young adult, or an adult, and also being a journey companion of someone else, for example, in a ship. The research questions that we've so far defined, but of course this can change along the way, are the following. So, what were the survivors' experiences related to mobility, migration, and integration? What meanings do survivors render to these experiences? And how do national and cultural contexts appear in the survivors' narratives, which we think is particularly interesting given the comparative dimension of the project. Some of the main themes that derive from these questions are the following, but of course this is not an exhaustive list, we're still exploring. So places of origin, trajectories which include geographies, intensities, and temporalities, migration processes and reasons to migrate, aid networks, or not only aid, but migration networks as well, conditions of places of destination, and all of these, I have to say, are terms that we've identified in the testimonies themselves. Some categories are ours as we keep constructing them or refining them, but these terms come also from their own testimonies. And that includes weather, food, politics, anti-Semitism, or even xenophobia, first impressions and encounters, neighbors, schools, work, communities, otherness and identity, and citizenship and belonging, to mention just some of them.
Yes. So this week we have been discussing the 4 key categories that we will consider in our research. The first one is mobility, and we consider mobility as 2 different experiences. On one hand, forced displacement during the Holocaust, and on the other, post-war movements in Europe before migration to Latin America. The second is migration, and we propose that the migration process as 2 consecutive and different instances, the journey from Europe to Latin America, and the first impressions as encounters, as Yael said, with the local society. The third one is integration, and during our discussion, we decided to incorporate to this category the process of acculturation, adaptation, and belonging, and with its challenges. We also have considered citizenship and identity as 2 relevant elements to look at during these processes. We will be also aware of bringing new theoretical concepts to the category, such as cultural hybridity, and use them as a tools to illuminate unseen areas. So we are beginning with this concept, but we think that in the process we will find others that can be more accurate or apply in a better way to our phenomenon. We are not considering these categories as static elements, but as layers that intertwine between them, bringing complexity to the phenomenon. And the last one is memory, as we work with narrative, oral narrative of the past. This includes the consideration of the subjectivity as a main element of the source, the place of trauma, of course, in the experiences of survivors and in their narratives, the construction of the narrative in itself, the visualization of individual and collective memory, among others. Now, Susana will refer further about the analysis of narratives.
Thank you. We pretend to analyze the different meanings, layers of the narratives of memory and self-interpretations of individual experience found in the Visual History Archive of the SOA Foundation. In addition, this archive's singularity also lies on its visual component, which allows us to identify the emotions of the survivors and to observe their corporal language. On the other hand, this archive also led us to study the history of children, subjects who have traditionally been marginalized by the Latin American historiographic dominant narrative. It has been difficult to know the experience of child migration because of the limited sources that include childhood experiences. In the Visual History Archive, the children appear in their multiple conditions, being both Jews, children, and migrants. We also think that Jewish children, as well as other foreigner children who arrived to Mexico, should be recognized in historical research, not only as part of a cultural community, but also as a part of the national society and also as a constitutive part of the Latin American childhood. Thus, in these testimonies, we can find life experiences, memories of childhood, as well as the history of emotions. Aware of the fact that these memories of childhood were built once this stage of life is over, they will allow us to integrate categories such as mobility, migration, and integration with childhood, as well as contribute to the reconstruction of the history of the plurality of Latin American children.
Okay, so this week we were thinking about what kind of things we could compare. So Emmanuel and I tried to make some kind of experiment about how to compare Mexico and Argentina. And I will talk about 2 points of comparison, and Emmanuel will talk of another 2. And it doesn't mean that we are only going to compare Mexico and Argentina. It was just like an exercise, yeah. So the first point is the trajectories of mobility. They are very different in Mexico and Argentina. Survivors who finally settled in Buenos Aires often arrive earlier to neighboring countries such as Paraguay or Uruguay or Bolivia. And from there, Buenos Aires was seen as an ideal and very attractive city. Buenos Aires was built in the imaginary of European people as the most European city of Latin America and a cosmopolitan and modern city. On the other hand, Mexico City didn't have that reputation. The memory of the not-so-distant Mexican Revolution depicted the country as a troubled one, and Mexico was considered, in many cases, as a place of transition in their way to the United States, although the most of the survivors who entered Mexico remained there. The second point, the testimonies of survivors who entered Buenos Aires refer a lot to the internal political situation of the country. Jews in Argentina became involved in politics since the beginning of the 20th century and were always very aware of the political situation. Survivors talk about Peronism, about dictatorships, about the bombing of the AMIA, the Central Jewish Agency in Argentina. In contrast, in Mexico, there was an explicit constitutional prohibition to foreigners to become involved in politics, and they didn't. Testimonies of survivors in Mexico almost don't refer to the political internal situation. Their first impressions refer to the weather, the food, the people in donkeys, the cactus, and in general, the narrative alludes to sensations and feelings and not to politics.
Third, testimonies of survivors in Argentina relate them when they came to the country in the 40s and 50s, the regime was anti-Semitic one. And this image contrasts with the idealization of Buenos Aires that had been constructed before. This idea of Argentina as a country with a great deal of anti-Semitism will remain present along the entire interview. Let us remind you that the interviews had place since 1995, and that was only 1 year after the bombing of the AMIA, the Central Jewish Committee in my country. In contrast, Mexico was seen as a country of open arms and its government as a generous and sensitive regime toward refugees. The truth is that Argentina was the country that received the largest amount of survivors, between 30,000, and let them legalize the situation in an amnesty given by Perón in 1949. And Mexico, on the other hand, was one of the countries that received the smallest amount of survivors, less than 2,000, and didn't allow the work and obstruct the legalization and naturalization of the survivors for a long time. It is not our aim, of course, to prove them wrong, but to understand how they remember and how they construct their narratives about the countries of receptions. And in the same way, this allows us to see how national and cultural context affect the experience of the person, their memory, and their main narrative, which is a central question of our project. In some relates of Mexico and also in Chile, it is very notorious that the gratefulness that the survivor expressed towards the country of reception in contrast, for example, to the narratives of the Argentinian survivors, who doesn't think so much. So, why this gratefulness appears in some relates and not in others? In this case, we are interested in researching how this thankfulness could have been constructed as a part of a collective memory, since survivors show a very similar discourse in this field, even using the same words. We could even think of writing a history of gratefulness by comparing the testimonies of survivors to Latin America.
As we keep seeing, this type of comparative analysis are very enriched by the different disciplines that we came from or that we're representing. And actually, this is some sort of typology, but it's just an attempt to draw what are the different sources of that are letting us imagine how to portray or how to make visual or how to transmit all these ideas we've been just discussed just now. And then what we've seen and what we have discovered is that how should we use the archive and its potentialities to do these things I just said. And for example, by checking up carefully the indexing terms and by having the possibility to actually enter the archive, and something that is not really easy, as we will see, we can create, for example, new databases and sets of information that will let us to reach that type of analysis. And by that, we can actually think about representative samples that will actually make more rigor to this analysis. Some of the things that we have tried to use by reaching social sciences tools have been something called circular migration plots, a tool that we use in the past lessons and legacies. It looks more or less like this. What we've been doing with this is trying to draw what are the geographies of mobility through different sources, not necessarily maps. And this will show the diversity, the complexity of mobility and survival as a category that is never static, It's always movement, especially for refugees. And then for refugees, for survivors better. That I will say myself with that category. So actually what we try to do with these circles is to create some sense of frequency, of temporality, of patterns. Here we can see multiple force displacement trajectories, how and when do the survivors try to return to their places of origin, for example, when did and how did, and whether they stayed at DP camps, and the transit locations, the travel trajectories, and the points of entry and the places of settlement, and how those places actually can diverge from country to country. We have noticed, for example, that in Chile and Mexico, they tend to stay in main cities, in Santiago and Mexico City. But in Colombia, like capital cities, although they entered by the ports. But in Colombia, for example, and this is very important also because it talks a lot about the diversity of the nation. We talk about a country of nations more than the Colombian nation. And here we see that they enter through Barranquilla or Buenaventura, that are the Caribbean or the Pacific port, and they will go through different cities. They will displace to Medellin, to Cali, to Bogota, of course, and therefore that also says a lot about the settlement of previous Jewish communities in the country and how those are also moving communities. And well, that's pretty much from social sciences. Also, there are other resources we can use as text mining, but we're seeing how to apply those things. From history, we're also trying to reach different methodologies, as for example, something very innovative that have come to our attention is history of emotions, and different ways to do horror history analysis, and of course without losing the view of the national context, the history of the national context in which these narratives, taking into consideration their different periods of time, the different periods of time that survivors are referring to, how those different times are framed by the local realities that they are reaching. And in general, of course, memory studies are the vertebral column, you say, is not the word, for the type of analysis and methodologies we're approaching to in order to understand better the narratives. And now it's time to talk about the challenges.
Lorena, can you go back to the circular migration plots? Because I think
I don't know, yeah.
It illustrates what Wolf said in the very beginning, I think, because what we did here is to take the oral testimonies as our main source. From the oral testimonies, we traced the trajectories of these individuals. And what's interesting, I think, and there the historians come in, is to interpret these narratives of mobility. So mobility encompassing the forced migration and the post-war movements of people, and then therefore we had a debate about whether to use only mobility encompassing also migration. We decided to keep them as two separate categories. We can explain more in the discussion sessions why we did that. But then comes interpretation. So it's not only about mapping the trajectories, but understanding how are individuals understanding their own experience and self-interpreting their histories. At the same time, I think it's interesting because it shows geographies, it shows temporalities, it shows intensities of movement, as well as particular places of destination in the region. So it's more complex than perhaps we thought initially when we saw Latin America as a region of rescue for 100,000 people between 1933 and 1945. It really makes it much more complex. So I think the history and the social sciences dialogue in some way in these plots. Then we come back, we can come back to this. We'll close with the following. So the next one. So really we also discussed what kinds of challenges we face as a team. And access is one, because we don't have points of access to the archive in Latin America. We know we have the support from the USC Shoah Foundation to examine, explore new ways. So as we go back, we're thinking about also what institutions in our own countries can be perhaps interested in having access to this, and how can we do that. The second part is a collaborative work, because as we all speak the same language, we live in very different places, and it's very hard to meet in person, and we're really grateful to the center for bringing us here as a team, because some of us are meeting for the first time in person. And so we're also thinking about ways of doing a second meeting at some point, perhaps in Latin America, so that we can continue with this work. The third one is funding. So we started exploring some grant possibilities, both nationally and internationally, so that we continue with this work. And I think the last slide really talks about other things that have come to our minds, such as, well, meeting in person, perhaps try to look for funding also to do a workshop, so that we broaden this community that we started, and a panel for lessons and legacies next year, a publication that hopefully would have a comparative approach, which we think is innovative, and again, project grants. So we're working on all of that as well. So I think that was the last slide, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much. I mean, this was, if you noticed, how kind of a little bit rushed about the challenges. I mean, the challenges are huge, I have to say.
Yes.
And that's also why we decided to bring them here, because when we met, I realized how hard it is to do this kind of work in Latin America. And this is part of kind of our effort to support this. But nevertheless, it's really, I think, a big challenge when you want to work with the testimonies and you don't have access there. So that's, I think, it's first an institutional problem, structural problem, and we talked about ways maybe to also help from our side to kind of create ways to bring the archive to Latin America, because there's no other way that they can do the project. But now I open the floor to questions, comments, and so on. And just wanted to remind you, this is really the first kind of result of 1 week of, not even 1 week, we are actually only 3.5 days in of kind of time to spend together, to think about things, to develop some kind of methodology, to find a topic which kind of is worth to really work on and spend a lot of time and energy in the future. And so just that you have this in mind. Okay, so I open the floor. Who wants to? Any comments? I mean, to break the ice, I just start with this. So I have several questions. But one is what was actually mentioned already by Yael. When I looked at the mobility migration and as pattern, I found it a little bit peculiar why forced displacement is not under migration but under mobility. And maybe you can a little bit explain your concept and why you differentiate between the two.
Yes.
What does it mean for your project?
Yes.
So your question was why forced displacement is in the migration plot?
No, in the
The
mobility,
difference
not in the
between
migration.
migration and
It's a different
forced-
category.
Forced mobility.
Because we were, I think, I keep thinking, so I think we were thinking of voluntary and involuntary decisions on the one hand. I think also what drove our interest initially as we worked for the Past Lessons and Legacies conference was to understand these causes of movement, and they are very different. So what is closely intertwined with genocide is very different from the post-war experience, where the individuals are still have not fully recovered their social agency or are in the process of doing that. And then when they decide to migrate, I understand it may be under huge constraints too, so I don't think about it as completely voluntary. but at least there is already a sense of, okay, I go there. Even in the narratives, you see that I, as taking the decision to move on. So I don't know if I'm answering that. The other thing in terms of, I think the plots should be redone. Like we showed really what we did before, because they also capture different things in one plot. So I think, for example, that the journey itself from Europe to Latin America should be in a different plot if we're able to do that, because sometimes they don't talk about it in depth or thoroughly, but other times they do. So if they stop in, I don't know, Morocco, Havana, and then Veracruz, it's very different from spending 6 months in Paris as you wait for an entry visa. So that should also be distinguished, because since we're interested in other questions like identity and belonging and all of that, those I don't think they're nuances. I think they're important things that should be considered. So I think what's interesting about the plots, as I see them more, is that we can, for example, take our whole sample. If we come up with a sample of what if we did, I don't know, 300 individuals, and then individually plot their trajectories, but then we can play with it and perhaps see, okay, now what if we group them based on country of destination, or what if we group them based on type of trajectory, as they were sent to a camp, or and then maybe a DP camp, and so we don't know what would this show, but I think it's an interesting thing to explore. So I hope I've answered what you asked.
Yeah, can I add something that we realized in the testimonies that a lot of people after the war moved from one country to another. For example, if a person was in a camp, obviously he or she tried to come back to her own city or village, but then sometimes with the main family, they move to another place and try to build a new life, but they realize that it's impossible, so they move again. So that's, for us, is more mobility, and we tend to conceptualize migration when they realize that they have to move for better to Latin America. So from that point and all the journey to this new country, for us is the migration process. But we are working in those concepts because they're also, how do you say, traslapan?
Overlap.
Yeah, they overlap, so they are not separate.
I think that last point is very important, because these are not categories like first is mobility, then they migrate, and then they integrate. They're all the time here and there, coming and go and intertwining one and another, and redefining the idea that the subject himself or herself are given to the experience of mobility and survival itself. So that's
all good. Yeah.
I wanted to add something that I found very, very, very amazing with the approach that you
Sorry,
did.
Sandra, can you speak a little?
Yeah.
Louder.
I found very, very interesting and very nice the huge approach that you are doing on that, and I think that that is going to bring very different aspects, which will contribute also very much a lot to an historical view on migration studies. I wanted to suggest that one of the descriptions always made on this discrepancy is not the idea of diaspora and how transnational identity is being elaborated. And in certain terms, especially if you see them from the biographical part, that people are not, you don't know exactly if you're going to stay in a place, you're moving over them. So never, there's almost impossible to look back. You can only look backwards and say, okay, that was migration, it was not, this and those. It brings, and it will be great, a more diverse specialization for migration studies as well, but because they're as much as they start to study on that, they realize, oh, we have to find new concepts, and that's where all these ideas of transnational circular migrations are created and found. But that gives you, looking from a historical perspective, also also other ideas where other people ends much more later in their life. It brings a lot of information for refugees.
Thank you.
Yes.
I-
Can I say
Sorry.
just something about what you
Hay una
just
pregunta.
said? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Just very briefly that you're right, because we realized we had to incorporate to our sample people that thought that they were going to live for better in one of those 4 countries, but then because of, for example, political situation, in Chile was the coup
Argentina,
d'etat,
yeah.
the dictatorship, they move again. So at the beginning, for Legon and Legacies, we didn't consider that sample, in the sample, these people. And now we, looking through the archive, we have found cases of people that move again from Chile to United States or other countries because of the political situation. So you're right.
That's the way in the case of Argentina too, because
Yeah.
you found some testimonies that when he talked about the last dictatorships, they introduced the idea that they have to go again. Not the survivors, but yes, their sons, the daughters, they have to move again. Never, it's the Neverland,
definite.
Definite. Yes, that's
Place.
right. Sorry?
Oh, yeah, I was wondering, I guess you found the testimonies by the location of the interview. Is that how you kind of found your set of testimonies, is the countries that the interviews took place in?
So thanks to
Yes.
Kristen and to Martha, and that's one way
One
we've
way.
done it, but not the only one, because they helped us find other ways to search. So because if we only did that, so then like Nancy said, we would have only the people who at least at the moment of the interview were living in that place
Right.
for the most part, and then we're missing all those individuals who might have left, and that's important for the processes we're analyzing. So what we try to do now was to broaden that scope, and also just insert the word, for example, Mexico, and then people may be referring to Mexico, but they were not necessarily interviewed in Mexico in 1996, or so yes and no. I mean, we're doing more than just that. Yes.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Because I was curious about the people who were living in, the countries that you're researching. Were they, for the most part, or have you looked at what languages they were speaking? Were they already speaking Spanish, in the 90s, or did they?
Yes, yes, they
speak
were all,
their original
yes.
languages? Were they speaking Polish? I mean,
That's fascinating because
Yes.
as we've discussed this, they were asked to choose the language of
The
the
interview.
interview.
Yes.
However, what's fascinating is how they mix languages. So they may be referring to one situation and then suddenly incorporate Polish or Yiddish or French or
Yes, but
and-
basically they choose Spanish as the language for the interview.
but not all
Yes,
of them.
but I
Not
guess
all of
it's
them.
it's also has to do with the language of the interviewer.
No,
But,
and they
but
said-
It was more-
some also have an interview in English, even if they were interviewed in Mexico. So I guess the people from the Shoah Foundation can explain this better,
Yes.
including
No.
Nita, who's sitting across the table, but
No.
but not because those who were interviewed in the United States, I understand they were interviewed in
Yes,
English. But
yes.
I assume that someone from the Shoah Foundation, Visual History, the right name at the time, came from the United States to interview them in Mexico. In fact, I know, for example, that Miriam and Luis Tillman were just visiting New York City, and they were interviewed by a friend from Hungary, and she interviewed them in English. So, but most of them, as Alejandra says, are interviewed in Spanish.
That also depends on the country. For example, in Colombia we had a specific case, and only 15 testimonies were taken in Colombia. It meant that 15 survivors were living in Colombia at the time of when the interview was taken, and all of them were interviewed in Spanish. There was an important migration to Florida. There's always been, like, Colombians are the second largest population, if I'm not wrong, in Florida. And they, well, it also has to do with the conflict, and some of them migrated due to the conflict influence in the country. But when they were there, some of them were still speaking Spanish. So even if it's more common to find Spanish speakers in Florida as well doing the interviews. But there's also a large number of them, as in the other cases, that were given their interviews in Spanish. In total, only 30 are in Spanish in the Colombian case. 30 are in Spanish and the rest are in English. Approximately 100 in total, 100. So it's an important thing to think about. And yeah, well, that will change the subject. In Argentina, it's different as well.
Yes, and maybe it's interesting too, in the case of the use of languages, that in some cases and some interviews, you know that people use a little Spanish and or German or Polish or Yiddish, yes, and in others they speak fluently Spanish. And maybe I think in Susana, what Susana presents about the age of the survivors when they arrive to the country, and well, that you can see the kind of integration or involved in the culture of the country, and this is another thing that it was interesting to analyze in the case of the use of languages. Yeah.
I think, could I ask?
Yes, Ita, please.
It depended a lot on who you could get to interview.
Yeah.
In Argentina, you had enough in different languages. You could handle just about any language.
Yeah.
I don't know in Colombia if you could or not. And also, it depended on the amount of acculturation, how comfortable they felt, and why did they get to that country, and did they want to stay there? Many had to stay because they had no other place to go. So the acculturation process was extremely important to the language that they chose to give the interview. That's what I have found.
Yeah, but it was very important, the approach of Susana, because her subject is children history, and because when you arrive to a country as a child, you have a lot more possibilities to learn language without accent or whatever. And when you are an adult, it's even more difficult. So some of our interviews have a lot of accents and refer to words in German or Yiddish or whatever. And the ones that were children is completely different. They even add some slangs from Chile, the local words that they are very touching for example, for me as a Chilean, that they speak with this kind of words. They are like part of the identity. So it's very interesting. We are thinking to analyze the ways in people tell the narrative, not only the contents of narrative, because we think that there are a lot of layers of meaning there. So that's a possibility as well.
And did you find much of a difference in terms of the language and when all of you analyzed the testimonies? Was there a difference in the way they understood this, for example, the language and of the the way, not Spanish. Spanish is common to all of you, but there are differences. There are nuances to the languages. Did you find any difference in the nuances of the languages?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not
No.
yet.
No.
It's there.
It should be there.
It should be there.
Sí, ¿cómo el lenguaje?
My question is,
Ale.
I'll let you guys need to. My question is to you, but anybody can feel free to jump in. My understanding, if it's correct, is you're saying that the gratitude towards the receiving country has nothing to do with how well somebody is received, that one can be received very well and the path smooth toward integration and towards being able to work and towards one's children being accepted, and one can perceive oneself to be not well received, and the opposite can be true, that one can have barriers put up towards in the recipient country, and that one can nevertheless be so grateful to have arrived anywhere that they imagine themselves to have been received with open arms.
Yes.
That the two, that
Mhm.
the effort put in by the country that's receiving has not too much to do with the gratitude of the people arriving.
Yes.
Something like that.
Both
Well,
of
that's interesting. First, I apologize for my English.
No
Because
apologies.
you make question for me. Well, first, I want to say, in the case of Argentina, I look something interesting that the testimonies that I found in Argentina, but there are people who came from Paraguay, Brazil, Uruguay, they always introduce that the idea that Buenos Aires was the horizon, the city that they have to go. And when the interviewer asked, well, now you're in Buenos Aires, what happens there? Well, this is an anti-Semitic country. It's strange, because you have in the first part of the testimony, you have that Buenos Aires is the horizon, and then it's an anti-Semitic country. And when we talk about that with Daniela in the case of Mexico, with Nancy in the case of Chile, it's interesting because they introduced that idea that it's a country, it's a dangerous country for Jewish life in the 20th century, and that is not the same in the case of Chile. And in the considerations, in the final considerations of the interview, the survivors never said, well, thank you, this is my country, this is a great place, this is beside me. But I understand that you have the idea that the Peronism is the Nazism of Latin America, then you have the dictatorship that persecute Jews, and you don't have that in Mexico. But at the same time, it's strange because when you look like with the eyes of a historian, you know that Argentina is the country that received the most,
The
largest.
for example,
largest.
in the case of Chile, it's just the opposite. At the end of almost all of the testimonies, they are very grateful to the country that received them in a very enthusiastic manner. And Chile closes its doors in January 1940, and it was very restrictive while accepting them, and the visas were subjected to go to work in the south of Chile. I mean, it was very restrictive, and Chile was was and is a very anti-Semitic country, but they don't feel it that way. So that's why the perspective of the individual is so interesting in our work, not the historic perspective. I mean, how it intertwines both.
Is the interpretation that they give to those situations. In the case of Colombia, they will blame a specific guy. They will say, López de Mesa, this specific, the foreign affairs minister, he was the mean guy. He was a horrible, horrible monster. But Colombia is a great place.
Yes.
It's the best country, and it should be in the wall of the Anna Frank Museum, and we should be acknowledged, and because this country allowed us to be who we are, and to raise this kind of, to work better, and to again make our.
But Daniela was the one that discovered this idea of the gratefulness. So why you explain a bit more about that?
Well, I also apologize if my English is not clear enough.
Everybody's English is damn good.
Okay, well, it was like very strange in the Mexican testimonies that people used to be extremely grateful. And a lot of testimonies, they talk about how grateful they feel, and they talk some ways in the same way, with the same words, about the liberty they found, about how Mexico was great, how everything was wonderful, and how grateful they are. And you can't find this kind of testimonies in other cases like Argentina. So we started to think, why? What happened in Mexico? And there is another thing I think very, very strange about Mexico, is that being a country that received the least amount of refugees, or one of the least, there is this discourse of Mexico as an open country, Mexico country of exile, of asylum, etc. And this is a discourse that the Jewish community in Mexico adopted. And they don't remember that it was very closed to Jewish refugees during Nazism. And I think it's because we have only the stories of the people who did came to Mexico. And we don't have the stories of all the people who tried to go to Mexico and could not. And all the ships that went to Veracruz and then had to go back to Europe because the Mexican government didn't allow the refugees to disembark. So it's a very partial history. And I think the Jewish community reconfigured this like conflictive episode in a positive one. Because I think of the history of the Jewish community in Mexico, and they try to always look for the points of coincidence with the government, and they don't want to confront, they don't want to revisit the conflict in the history of the Jewish community in Mexico. I think it's a huge theme that we want to explore, but one of the questions is, why are these refugees so grateful and some other are not so grateful? What is the history of gratefulness? So.
Yes, or perhaps it has to do with the way that society is in different countries, perhaps, and the process of acculturation, what we said afterwards. So that's why we have to look at.
And also we've been discussing with the group that we have to use the categories of individual memory, collective memory, and also the imaginary, because there is sometimes a distance between the individual memory and the collective one. And perhaps that's the case in Argentina. So it's very interesting what they have been discussing, because it applies to the four countries as well.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's a wonderful project that you have started, or are starting, or developing. I just had a few, I don't have paper, so I hope my head is still a little bit bright. I had a few things. First, indeed, I think that the tip of diaspora studies is very important. If you look at communities and centers of belonging and identity, and I think for your group, diaspora studies can be very interesting. The second thing I was wondering is about, it's just a few questions that I would like to raise, about the range of your project. So first, what do you want to compare exactly? Is it that you compare the reception in different countries? So you look at Mexico, how were Jews received in Mexico, how did it feel being in Mexico and in other countries? Or do you look at different groups of refugees, survivors, so young people, old people? I didn't hear women and men, but I think it's also a category. Or they come from different European countries, so different experiences. So what are you exactly comparing? And also, that has to do with the range, I think, is what is the time range, the time? So how far do you go in the time? Because I always stop at 1945, maybe 1950, but then I want to stop, because then, and I had the idea or the impression that you carry on until the 90s. And then so many things happen in so many different countries, so are there not too many different things at that moment? And then I was just, this is just a pure selfish thought, wouldn't it be interesting to also include other Latin American countries, for instance, the Dutch, the former Dutch, well, the West Indies and the Dutch Suriname, but also I remember from the Netherlands, quite a lot of Jews went to Paraguay, legal passports, and Uruguay. It's just purely because I'm interested, if you could include it also, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question.
I have another one there. Sorry.
Oh, I just got something to add, and that is these documents that were sent out all over the world when the project began in the 90s, in the early 90s. So flyers went all over the world asking for survivors in different countries. I wanted to tell you that we have those flyers rich information.
Okay,
If
great.
you wanted to try and mine that at some point.
Yes.
You could give me a list of the countries that you're interested in. I did actually pull the files on Argentina, because I was kind of interested in seeing those myself, and I went through those a little bit, but, it's something that we could do for like phase 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
¿Quién se avienta con la comparativa?
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of add a little bit to Geraldine's question about the other countries. I mean, I know this is really difficult, but I think at least kind of a side note of comparison, maybe even from literature would be good, just for sharpening actually your profile for your own countries.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
there are specifics about other countries, like, I mean, the one I know best is Bolivia. And so, for example, when I heard your presentation, I was immediately thinking about one special case in Bolivia, which I didn't hear in your presentation, is the mostly German, Austrian Jews who came to Bolivia created a new community against the old Polish-dominated
Yes.
Jewish community. So there were suddenly two Jewish communities. So when you talked about that they were actually going to settlements where Jewish communities were, in Bolivia it was the opposite. They went there, but they created their own.
Yes.
So do you have similar cases maybe in other
Yes.
in these
Yes.
countries or not? This would be one. The other one is that Bolivia is a case where there was although a big influx in a short amount of time, the transmigration was enormous. So nobody really stayed in Bolivia. Many went to Argentina, Israel, or the US. So the remainder is very small of the community. And when you compare this maybe to Colombia, I don't know if there may be similar things. So that's just what I think, that when you look at these other countries, you can sharpen the countries you actually work on at the target.
Well, I think that,
See?
okay, I think that it's a little bit early to explain what are we going to compare, because we couldn't hear the testimonies yet, only very, very briefly. So we need to work. We need to work on the testimonies. I think we're going to start country by country, and then we are going to make the comparison. So I hope.
It's just a luxury problem. You have so much beautiful materials.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the possibilities are great. But we have a huge problem, is that we don't have access in our countries to the archive. So
Only in Chile.
yeah, only Chile. Sorry, but we will figure it out.
Can I ask you why Chile?
Has the
How
archive.
did you get there?
Well, as Wolf said, we have a Jewish Holocaust museum in Santiago, and last year we decided to license the testimonies of the Chilean survivors, but not only the ones who were interviewed in Chile, but also the ones who talk about Chile. So we have 82 testimonies available at the museum for research and for the complete testimonies. So that's good, but it's only for Chile. So for example, if Nancy and I want to compare something with Argentina or perhaps Colombia, we just have only the Chile ones, but that's good.
Where did you get the support to do this?
Where
The
did we,
support
from the museum.
from the,
Yes.
for the museum.
From
From the museum.
The
Got
museum.
the support.
Yes, I mean, the museum decided to license the testimonies,
So the
and we
museum-
got in contact with the Schwa Foundation.
I want to say
Yes.
something about the comparison question, because I agree with Daniela too, but some of the reference on the comparison way need the analysis, of another source, and the challenge for us is to work with the visual Holocaust archive, and I know that in that way the interesting is to analyze, to work with the testimonies from the survivors, and I think there are many of the questions like how it's cómo fue la llegada, cómo fue
The arrival.
half the arrival. Maybe I don't going to found the answers on the testimonies, but But so I wanted to work with the memory, the oral history, the representation of the cases. I mean, that is the interesting thing to be working all together here. No?
Yeah, and also because with Yael and Lorena we have analyzed some testimonies for the Lesson and Legacy Conference last year. For example, we decided to, in the range of time, to start 1933, and because of the testimonies were enunciados were addressed or in the 90s. The idea is to cover all this period. The only problem is the interview focus obviously on Holocaust, the pre-war lives of the survivors, and at the end the life after the war, especially the arrival to Latin America, the first years, and not a lot about the other years. But also we consider, for example, that it's very important the moment of people give testimony, because the background is really important as well. So that's, we consider that range of time. And we try to obviously study different ages of the survivors, different countries where, in Europe, obviously men and women, but we need to work a lot more about that to construct our sample.
Sorry, we have.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you guys got a sense of roughly, what percentage of people stayed in Latin America and what percentage of people, left Latin America, and what kind of distinguished the people who stayed versus the people who left.
Well, each country is different.
Yes, I will tell you about the Mexico testimonies that I have listened so far, because of course I haven't listened to all. So the ones that I've listened to, most of them stayed in Mexico. Yet I found this week some who left Mexico, and it varies tremendously from not finding a place in the initial years for themselves, for having a strong connection with place of origin, so going back to Germany, for example. And then as time goes by, I mean, it may be related, maybe more like conventional migration reasons than anything then related to the Holocaust itself, no? So that I've seen. Then their identity of migrants is like what we're exploring also is that these are not just migrants. I mean, these people come from a genocide.
Yes.
So let's not forget that, right? So then the moment of arrival is different for them also than just another. Not saying it's worse. I'm just saying it's different. And I think we would have to look at the whole whole population that was interviewed, and yet that may not also represent the whole population of survivors who came to Mexico. But at least it gives you maybe a hint of what maybe a possible pattern. And also what I found is that some people came, like the moment in terms of the temporality of arrival. That's also interesting. Because most, I think, if I'm not wrong, because again I haven't looked at all of them or their biographical profile for all of them, but and I think that's not in the bio profile, so you have to listen to that segment for all of them. Most are concentrated between 45 and 48, 50. But survivors coming to Mexico afterwards, and one came in 68 because he was living in Czechoslovakia, and the Russian invasion was a reason to leave. One came in 50-something because he was living in Venezuela, but he met a woman in Mexico and moved to Mexico. One came, much later because of work reasons, and then decided to leave again. So it shows a diversity, and that's fascinating.
For example, in the case of Chile, they left because of direct related issues with the Holocaust, for example. In the beginning of the 70s, communism with Allende was chosen democratically. So the Jews that escaped communism after, 1956 perhaps, they were so scared about this and they left Chile. But after the coup d'etat in 1973, there was another group that escaped also because they were afraid of a conflict and of a dictator. So you can see how the Holocaust also influenced, how their Holocaust experience influenced on their migration again to other countries due to the internal conflicts.
And there is a case, Daniela. No, very interesting. That is a person that immigrated from Germany to Chile, and then with the dictatorship, he was persecuted and asked for prison and asked for asylum in Germany. So he went to live in Germany, and then he came back to Chile during the dictatorship to help children that were in danger because of their parents were opposite to
It's a very peculiar situation because he was the first person that the German embassy took out of Chile during the Pinochet persecution, and the German embassy was not very collaborative on helping people during the dictatorship. So it's very unique case.
Daniela.
But this is a very good question, and I think it's one of our questions also. Because if we find out that in some country 25% of the refugees left, and in another country all of them stayed, well, that will be saying something about the conditions of the country, and so it's something that we want to explore also.
Yes.
Thank you for this presentation, and I really applaud your comment too on the comparisons and all kinds of comparisons that could be done, like on gender and everything. But one thing I've missed in terms of what your approach, which I'd like to hear a little bit more of what you're finding out, is on the history of emotions.
Yes.
Are you discovering patterns of emotions or specific things when the testimonies, when they talk? There's some emotional changes, some numbness, these kinds of things.
Susana.
My English is so bad, excuse me for that. Not yet, really, not yet, but we are looking for something that we think is very important in this archive, that is the visual. We have worked with oral sources, but you can see the actor who is talking, and for us it's very important to see their gestuality, when they cry, when they silences themselves, when they smile, and to cross this with his or her narratives, oral narratives, and we are very interested in this, about the fear, about the happiness in their new countries, about their nightmares, and it is in process yet. No?
So that's something that we can expect as the analysis.
We want to do that. But for example, we have found in the Chilean case that in some cases there is a pattern of construction of the narrative. So the beginning of their children's lives, they characterize them as a very happy time and with a lot of very beautiful adjectives, and life was wonderful.
And sometimes use the same words to describe that.
And in just in a few cases they said, no, it was okay, but nothing splendid. But most of the cases, life was wonderful. Then the Holocaust stopped everything and disrupt their biographies. And then when they are living again in Latin America, they start again to talk about positive adjectives, not in the same way perhaps when we're children, but still.
But that's also the way the interview is set up. It starts with begin with the beginning and then end with good. You have to end with happy.
It's like a circle.
So then you I find it sometimes very difficult that it's not
Yeah,
There are some
and
limits.
and it depends also in the age of the person, because some of the interviewees, we have more than one interview, and for example in an age that person was still very alive, and another when is a lot older, and in the one that is a lot older is a lot more sad, perhaps. The accent is put in the Holocaust and the losses, you know, the people, the family, the people that they love, they are not there anymore. So it's very interesting when you can compare interviews in different times.
And we found that in many cases, when is somebody waiting for them in the new country, they saw this country like beautiful, nice, smells good, and the food is rich, and when is nobody waiting for them, they feel anxious and with fears, and the food is really mala. No?
Sorry, we have two people there, so they want to ask something. Sorry, Shafali, do you want to make you too? Sorry, a little
Oh, sorry.
louder.
I just wanted to make a comment, but none of you really should be apologizing for your English. Present in a language that's not your first language.
Thank you.
Oh,
yeah.
Good for you.
You, please. Yeah.
Many thanks for this inspiring presentation and the discussion. I am a historian, and I wonder, I love the way how you appreciate by doing this research to make value to this universe of interviews. And there could be a second path of appreciating these interviews, and this is to look also for the sources you find at the International Tracing Service.
Yes.
This is one.
Yeah. We talk about that.
Yeah, okay. And the other is the Jewish, the joint Jewish distribution. So I just 40 days ago or so, I found a letter from a German Jew who had been in Argentina, and on the one hand he was very happy, and on the other hand he was longing for coming to the US and expecting everything from the USC when he comes with all his luggage at the harbor in New York and getting support. So very intense, very emotional letter.
Yes.
Eagerness, anxiety, everything was in. So very rich source, only 3 pages of the letter. And when you have this, just for some of your cases, comparing with the emotionality you found in the interviews, this can also, again, be a good way to appreciate the interviews in comparison to other sources.
Thank you. Sorry,
we discussed.
I think we have a vast collection first to incorporate and analyze, and that will take us a long time. And of course, that's also very important work that hopefully at some point in the future we can do. We have also national archives in our own country that are underexplored. And for me, I can tell you that the Shoah Visual Foundation archive took me to the archive in Mexico because it was through the testimony of one individual. So also the inspiration of starting with individuals and taking that as a model. And then when I went to the archive, thanks to my friend and colleague Daniela, because it's hard to access that archive, and I put the name, but not only I knew the name, thanks to the interview, I knew the name of the person who brought that person to Mexico, I knew the date of birth of the relatives, I knew, and then I found like a whole file on her family that no one probably had ever looked at. So of course that's a different task, and hopefully in the future we can also achieve that, but it's very sad. for
Yes,
now we have a lot of work and a great source to explore.
I also had an experience like Yael's with listening to an interview. A woman said that during the 70s, someone that he didn't remember who was, went to Chile and took some archives. She worked for the Hayas, you know the Hayas. She worked for the Hayas, and she said that someone, she didn't recall, a gringo, took their archives, the Hayas archives in Chile, and sent them somewhere to take care of them during the 70s, perhaps through Allende or Pinochet. And I said, we have to find those archives. And after a year, I found them at YIVO in New York, and I went there to research them. And according to the records of researchers for that archive, I was the first person to open them after they got them. So the testimonies are not only rich on emotions, on subjectivity, but on dates and actual facts. You know? Yes, it's vast. This can be a monumental work. So it's.
But as an historian, also, I think it's very important to. To cross the different sources, because sometimes oral history it can be
misleading.
Yeah. Sometimes people remember things that didn't happen, and sometimes you need to know the other story, what the archives are telling also, and this I think let you understand the testimonies in a better way. But I think we need to use also archival sources.
You talk about the joint committee distribution, and Alejandra said the highest. And one of the interesting things in the testimony is that when you put in the search migration to Argentina, aid organizations, they put 0. But I know that you have in Argentina a lot of organizations like Soprotimis, Hayas, Joint Committee Distribution, World Jewish Congress, a lot of people working for the campaigns to help refugees, but there are not that not appear in the testimonies of survivors. And what do you do? Well, I think the way is the historian way that you cross sources, not to put in duda,
not to question
the testimony, but to have and
more elements to interpret.
The biggest picture.
I want to add that one discussion that we have is that we are going to work with subjectivity but we want to appreciate the interpretations of these actors about historical facts and his own experiences. No? They are subjectivity source, but also an interpretation of a subject about the history.
And also I think, to a little bit, not in contraposition to what he said, but I look at it in a different way. I think that, for example, I did a search for joint. I think it was because Crispin helped us bring all the testimonies together from the 4 countries he left already. So we have already all of them together to do searches throughout the sample. And when we put joint, let's say 20, I don't remember the exact number, but a good number, not enough perhaps, given what we know about how much joint helped. Mm-hmm. However, then you ask more questions. So why aren't they mentioning it more?
Yes.
And that's interesting in itself. And why are some actors invisible? Yes. Since we know that, well, I know through her, for example, that the central agency in Mexico was helping get their permits, disembarking, giving loans. Why is that social actor invisible in the narrative? And that's fascinating to ask. So it's not that it's misleading, it's that it leads me to ask, to think harder about these things too. So
how they Crispin and Marta.
Yes.
Marta as well.
Yes. Marta, yes, but he helped us in the end, put all of them, so now we have.
Yes.
Yes, Martha was.
Yeah,
That was
please.
wonderful.
Oh, not to create a competition or anything, because USC's resources are fantastic. But as of only several years ago, UCLA has been having an annual conference of Ladino Jews. And while probably most of them did not migrate to Latin America, there's probably some number of them that did, you know, like as you look at these people that didn't settle in a final country, that went from one country to another, to another, to another. And you may be able, through them, to get in touch with people that may have landed, you know, from someplace like Thessaloniki to Latin America, or from Italy to Latin America, or Greek. And it might be interesting, they'll be few in numbers, but it might be interesting to see what their memories would be to arrive in Latin America already knowing how to speak some sort of dialect of Spanish, the Ladino dialect.
Thank you.
But their resources, it's not as vast as the US.
Thank you.
You know, there's so much work that could be done.
Yeah.
Out of it, so I don't want, I'm just throwing out what would excite me if I joined in, would be, you know, so from an oral history perspective, but if somebody who was interviewed in 1990 and is still alive, how would they reconstruct it now, even if it, you know, just a single case or two? So that would be one project that I could look at. And another one, which I'm also personally involved in the American context, is the children and the children's children, and how they perceived the behavior and the silence and the whole interaction with the person who testified. So that would be another project.
Well,
I want to say something
actually in Chile,
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
actually in Chile, we interviewed in the 2010. We interviewed some of the people that are on the visual history archive. We interviewed 100. So we can do that comparison. It's almost 15, and some are 20 years different. So we can do that. But again, it's something else. Yes.
No, yes, I was thinking about that you said first. When we made the proposal to come here, we put one of the points of our interest in it was, it's not the comparison, but the relation between the memorial of the survivors, of Holocaust survivors, and the memorial of the dictatorships in the Chile, Uruguay, Argentina. And when we see the testimonies of the Visual History Archive, we found that they didn't say nothing between in relation with, but really the testimonies was taken in 1995, and the memory of the dictatorship, they don't have the strong in this public sphere that they have in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe if I made now the interviews, that relation, it came naturally.
Some of those unmentioned, like that weren't mentioned in the interview that was left out, those can be probed for in the interview setting.
Yeah,
and so
it's interesting.
It's a living, a living document.
Yeah, yes, I know. I found the testimony of Sarah Rus, one of the Argentinian survivors, and now it is one of the most famous testimonies in my country, because they have his testimony about about this experience in the Holocaust, but they miss her son in the dictatorship, and now it's one of the most important because they put in relation what happened with the Jews during the Holocaust and what happens with Jews during the dictatorship, and it's new. You have a TV program dedicated to Sarah Ruth. It's really good.
Was there fear involved in that, Emmanuel? Do you think somehow in 95, 96, with the military dictatorship being what it was, do you think that in part we don't get the information because they did not want to talk about it?
No, I don't think that. Maybe I think that in 1995, 1996, the important was the army bombing. In the public sphere, the dictatorship is a problem, but it's not the central problem. In the context, historical.
Because it was over.
Yes, you have a government that they deny the crimes of the dictatorships, but in fact, the army bombing was terrible, really terrible. But they have an fuerte, alto, strong impact, a strong impact in the public sphere up to date.
But I also think that it's important to have a balance of expectations regarding the testimonies themselves. And because that was something I found when I was looking at Colombia, and luckily La Violencia is an index term, so it actually appeared in several testimonies, and it was something that was going on in 1948. But then if I wanted to see maybe FARC or maybe paramilitary forces, several of them were threatened and kidnapped and that kind of things. There are works done in Colombia about documenting that kind of situations that actually motivated migration. But maybe since the time for questioning and asking about their new lives in their countries of arrival is not as long as the time during the Holocaust experience, you won't find that kind of things in the depth you would expect. And then once you see what has happened in the countries lately after the 90s, you will see that in Argentina or in Chile, the memory boom is stronger, and then maybe there are more initiatives in order to listen to the survivors. But in Colombia, that boom is just starting to happen. It's just happening now, actually. And then this kind of work is also part of that attempt of seeing the survivors' memory as part of the country's memory. That is something that has not happened yet. And then there's this type of experiences that, for example, I tried to contact one survivor and to interview them right now, but they're really old. They're really, really old, and this guy has dementia. And the whole family, it was a family topic actually to see if they wanted to be interviewed. And the thing is that they agreed. And the day before I went to them, they called me and said, please don't do that. Please don't do that. This morning he started to ask my son about things related to the camp and the train and things like mixing the granddaughter or the grandson as his brother in the camp when they were in the camp. So that situation disturbed the peace in the family, and they decided to just forget about it. And then it's harder and harder to have that kind of contrast. So yeah, actually that would be super interesting, but it also depends on the type of context of the countries and whether that possibility is a real one, as in Chile, and a more difficult one, as in Colombia.
You want to say something?
Yes. No, but I think we are running slowly out of time. But I think what I would say is you saw from all these different suggestions that your project actually sparked such a lot of interest and actually kind of created a lot of ideas, which not all you have to take on, but maybe what I would suggest is to think about your project itself, but then you all teach. So actually you can outsource some of the ideas to PhD or master projects, which then help your project kind of in-depth studies of certain points
you actually can't do, but would help to sharpen also your project. I mean, there are, I think, ways because there were several very interesting ideas floating around here. So I'm grateful to the audience, and I'm especially grateful for the project participants, and I hope this is a very, or I think everybody saw this, that this is a very convincing start, although very early on, for a very interesting project, and we hope that this goes a long way. Yeah?
Thank you.
So
Thank you
thank
very
you for
much.
doing
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you.